I wasn't even sure why I went up to the attic that day. Maybe I was looking for something to fill the silence of a lazy afternoon. Or maybe I just wanted to get out of my own head. The attic was exactly as I remembered, hot, stuffy, and packed with boxes my mom had labeled in her neat, precise handwriting. One box caught my eye. It was marked Memories in thick black marker. My curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I was sifting through old yearbooks, photo albums, and random knickknacks from our childhood. Then buried at the bottom I found it. A dusty black vase tape. Science Fair 2006. I read aloud, squinting at the faded label. I felt a small smile tug at the corner of my lips. I could hardly believe it had survived this long. I carried it downstairs like I was holding a fragile treasure. Our old vase player was still hooked up to the TV, and after a bit of fumbling I managed to get the tape rolling. The screen flickered, static giving way to grainy footage of the school gymnasium, crowded with rows of tables covered in projects. There I was, 15 years old, wearing jeans and a loose braid, standing beside my project, early cancer detection through enzyme analysis. I remembered that day so clearly. I'd worked for months, pouring every spare moment into my project. I even skipped a few of Ava's games, something my family had not so subtly reminded me about at the time. The camera zoomed in on my chart for just a second, and I felt a flicker of pride. But then the frame shifted fast. Suddenly, Ava's laugh filled the room, and the camera swung to her, standing in her cheerleading uniform, surrounded by her friends. "There's our superstar. Give us a spin, Ava." My dad's voice boomed from behind the camera. I froze, staring at the screen. The footage stayed on Ava, capturing her laughing and twirling in her uniform while I faded into the background, my voice barely audible. My chest tightened. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, rewinding the tape. This time I watched closely, hoping the camera would cut back to me, back to my project. But no, it didn't. Ava was the star of the show. My science fair project reduced to a blurry backdrop. "Superstar," I whispered bitterly under my breath. The sound of footsteps behind me made me jump. My mom walked into the room, wearing an apron dusted with flour. "Lily, what are you watching?" she asked, glancing at the screen. I turned to her, my voice sharper than I intended. "Do you remember this?" Her eyes narrowed as she stepped closer. "Oh, the science fair. That was such a fun day. Ava's cheer competition was the same afternoon. She was incredible, wasn't she?" I stared at her, the words hitting me like a slap. "And me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Do you remember my project? The one I worked on for 3 months?" Her smile faltered just slightly. "Of course, honey. You've always been such a hard worker. But, Ava really shined that day. That was when the college scouts first noticed her." I blinked, swallowing the lump rising in my throat. "I worked on something that could have saved lives, Mom. But all you saw was her uniform." "Lily, that's not fair," she said, her tone edging toward defensive. "We were proud of you too." "Were you?" I cut her off, pointing at the TV. "Because this tape doesn't show that. You didn't even record me explaining my project. You didn't even try." She sighed, brushing her hands on her apron. "Lily, you've always been independent. We didn't think you needed as much attention as Ava." Her words landed like a punch to the gut. "Didn't think I needed it." I let out a short, bitter laugh and shook my head. "Right," I said, pressing stop on the tape. "I guess I've always been the independent one." "Lily, wait," she said, taking a step toward me. I didn't let her finish. "I'm fine, Mom," I said tightly, brushing past her toward the stairs. "Thanks for the reminder." I heard her call my name as I climbed the steps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not with the tears already threatening to spill. Once I was in my room, I closed the door and sat on the edge of my bed. The tape had stirred something in me. Something I thought I'd buried a long time ago. It wasn't just the video. It was years of being the one who didn't need anything, the one who figured things out on her own while Ava soaked up the spotlight. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself it didn't matter. But in that moment, sitting in my quiet room with the weight of it all pressing down on me, I realized something. It did matter. As I stared at the wall, a thought struck me. I had buried myself so deeply in my resentment, I'd almost forgotten what that project had been about. Early cancer detection. My research, my charts, my process, they weren't just forgotten memories. They were real. Suddenly I got up and went back to the attic, my heart pounding. If the tape had survived all these years, maybe the research had too. I opened another box marked Lily's stuff, and dug through it, tossing aside old journals and notebooks. At the very bottom I found what I was looking for. A stack of yellowed papers bound together with a rubber band. My heart raced as I flipped through the pages. There it was, my old research. A note in my teenage handwriting caught my eye. Potential patent application. Pending further testing. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. I had forgotten about this. Life had swept me up and I'd let it all go. But now, looking at the results, the data, it was good. Maybe even groundbreaking. And for the first time in years I felt something stir in me, a spark. It wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. This was bigger than that. I didn't need their approval. What I needed was to finish what I'd started. Because the world deserved to see what I could do, even if my family never had. Dinner at my parents' house was as predictable as always. Ava, her husband, and their 2 kids were already seated at the long dining table when I walked in. My dad was at the head, sipping his usual scotch, and my mom was fluttering around the kitchen, making sure everything was perfect. "Lily, you're late," Ava said, flashing her usual dazzling smile as she motioned to the clock on the wall. "We were just talking about how you'd probably gotten lost in one of your projects." I forced a smile, ignoring the jab. "Traffic," I muttered, sliding into the empty chair at the far end of the table. Ava's kids were busy arguing over who got the last piece of bread, and her husband, Brad, was scrolling through his phone like he couldn't care less about being there. But Ava, she was holding court as usual. "Oh, and Brad has some big news," she said, nudging him with her elbow. Brad looked up, startled. "Oh, yeah, I got promoted. Regional manager now," he said, grinning like it was the achievement of the century. Everyone clapped and offered congratulations. Everyone except me. "That's great, Brad," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Congrats." "And what about you, Lily?" Ava asked, her voice dripping with feigned interest. "Still doing. What is it you do again?" I swallowed the urge to snap back. "I'm still working in biotech research," I said simply. "Actually, I got a job offer last week. It's with a startup in Seattle. They're working on—" "Oh, Seattle," my mom interrupted, setting down a plate of roasted chicken. "That's so far. You wouldn't be able to come home for things like this." I blinked, caught off guard. "I mean, it's a big opportunity. I'd be leading a team." "But what about family, Lily?" my dad chimed in, swirling his scotch. "You're finally close enough to see us regularly, and now you're thinking of running off again?" I glanced around the table. Ava was smirking, clearly enjoying the show. Her kids were oblivious, but Brad had the nerve to look bored. "It's not like I'm running off," I said, trying to stay calm. "This is about my career." "Your career," Ava said with a laugh. "You've always been so serious about that. Not everything has to be about work, Lily. Look at me. I balance work and family perfectly." "You don't even work," I muttered under my breath. "What was that?" Ava asked, her smile tightening. "Nothing," I said quickly, stabbing at a piece of chicken on my plate. The rest of dinner was a blur of small talk and Ava basking in the attention. When dessert was served, my mom made a special announcement, calling Ava's kids the future of our family, while making a big show of giving them homemade cookies in little decorative bags. I wanted to scream. By the time I got back to my apartment, my chest felt tight. I dumped my bag on the couch and sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the city lights. The job offer letter was still sitting on my kitchen counter, waiting for an answer. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Hey, Lily." Mr. Thomas, my elderly neighbor, greeted me with his usual warm smile. He held a tray of cookies, his signature peace offering. "Thought you might want a snack." I smiled despite myself. "Thanks, Mr. Thomas. Come in." He shuffled into the apartment, setting the tray down on my coffee table. "Rough night?" he asked, gesturing toward my slouched posture. "You could say that," I admitted, sighing. "Family dinner. It's complicated. Families usually are," he said, lowering himself into the armchair across from me. "You know, I've lived here a long time, Lily. I've seen you grow up in a way. You've always been the quiet one, haven't you?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, Ava's always been center stage. He chuckled softly. She sure likes the spotlight, doesn't she? I didn't say anything. But here's the thing about spotlights, he continued. They're bright, sure. But they only shine on one thing at a time. Everything else gets pushed into the shadows. Yeah, well, I've spent my whole life in the shadows, I muttered. Maybe it's time you stepped into the light, he said simply. I looked at him confused. What do you mean? You've got a choice to make, Lily, he said, leaning forward. You can keep living in that shadow, letting other people decide how much space you're allowed to take up. Or you can make your own light. Stop waiting for permission to be seen. His words hit me harder than I expected. It's not that easy, I said. No, it's not, he agreed. But nothing worth doing ever is. He stood up, brushing cookie crumbs off his shirt. Whatever you decide, just make sure it's your choice, not theirs. After he left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the job offer letter on the counter. For years, I'd been stuck in this endless cycle of trying to please a family that didn't see me. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that I was fine. But was I? Maybe Mr. Thomas was right. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for them to notice me. Maybe it was time to choose myself. I picked up the letter, running my fingers over the bold letters of the company's name. Seattle wasn't just a job. It was a chance to be someone, to step out of the shadows once and for all. The question was, did I have the courage to take it? The next family dinner came sooner than I wanted. My mom insisted I come, even after the awkward conversation about my job offer. She said it was important. When I arrived, the air felt different. Ava was glowing, more than usual, and everyone was sitting around the table, looking expectantly at her. What's going on? I asked, sliding into my usual seat at the end of the table. Oh, Lily, you're just in time, Ava said, practically bouncing in her chair. We have some big news. Her husband, Brad, cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable, but Ava nudged him. We're getting a divorce, she announced, her voice annoyingly cheerful, like she just won a prize. The room went silent for a beat. What? My dad said, his fork clattering onto his plate. Don't look so shocked, Ava said, laughing. It's been coming for a while. We just grew apart. No big deal. No big deal. My mom's voice was high-pitched, a clear sign she was trying to keep her composure. And, Ava continued, ignoring the tension, I'm engaged. That's when Henry walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed like he'd stepped out of a designer catalog. His perfectly polished smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Meet Henry, Ava said, grabbing his hand and pulling him forward. Hello everyone, Henry said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. It's a pleasure to meet Ava's family. There was a round of polite murmurs, but I couldn't shake the weird vibe coming off him. It was like he was too polished, too perfect. Throughout dinner, Henry charmed everyone. He complimented my mom's cooking, laughed at my dad's old jokes, and even got my niece and nephew to warm up to him with magic tricks. Ava was eating it up, leaning on his arm and gazing at him like he was some kind of superhero. But I couldn't stop watching him. Something about the way he smiled felt off, like it was practiced instead of genuine. When my dad asked about his work, Henry said he was in investment management, but the way he glossed over the details made me suspicious. What firm do you work for? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Henry's smile twitched slightly. Oh, it's a private firm. Mostly high net worth clients. Nothing you'd hear about. He quickly changed the subject, but my gut told me he was hiding something. After dinner, while everyone was fawning over Ava's engagement ring, I slipped out to the patio to get some air. That's when Aunt Hannah joined me. I see you're not as taken with Henry as the rest of them, she said, leaning on the railing beside me. Not really, I admitted. Something about him feels off. Hannah nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. You're not wrong, Lily. I looked at her, surprised. What do you mean? Hannah glanced back toward the house to make sure no one was listening. I've been looking into him. Ava told me about him a while ago, and I had a bad feeling, so I did some digging. She pulled out her phone and opened a folder of scanned documents. Look at this. I took the phone and scrolled through the files. There were bank statements, loan records, even a forged signature that looked eerily like Ava's. What is all this? I asked, my stomach sinking. Henry's broke, Hannah said bluntly. He's drowning in debt. Most of his so-called investments were scams, and he's been using Ava's name to take out loans. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Does Ava know? Hannah shook her head. Not a clue. He's got her wrapped around his finger. She thinks he's some kind of financial genius. And your parents? They're too smitten with the idea of Ava marrying another successful guy to see the truth. I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest. Why hasn't anyone said anything? Why haven't you said anything? Because Ava doesn't listen, Hannah said, her voice tired. She never has. And your parents would just brush it off like they always do. But you! She looked at me, her expression serious. You could get through to her. You're the only one who sees things clearly in this family. I laughed bitterly. You really think she'd listen to me? She's been ignoring me my whole life. Hannah placed a hand on my arm. Lily, this isn't just about family drama. If Henry keeps going, he's going to ruin Ava. And the kids. You can't just stand by and watch that happen. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my bed, staring at the documents Hannah had emailed me. It was all there. Proof of Henry's lies, his debts, his manipulations. I kept picturing Ava's face at dinner, so proud and happy. For all her faults, she didn't deserve this. Her kids didn't deserve this. But what would happen if I told the truth? Ava would hate me. My parents would probably accuse me of being jealous, of trying to ruin Ava's happiness out of spite. I glanced at the job offer letter on my desk. Seattle felt like an escape. An opportunity to start fresh, far away from all this mess. But could I really walk away knowing what I knew? My phone buzzed. It was a text from Aunt Hannah. Whatever you decide, just don't wait too long. They're planning to elope next month. I stared at the message, my chest tightening. I had a choice to make. Protect my family's image or risk tearing it apart to save Ava from Henry's lies. And this time there was no hiding from the decision. I spent the next week gathering everything. Aunt Hannah had given me a lot to start with, but I wanted to make sure I had all the proof I needed. I stayed up late every night, piecing together bank statements, loan applications, and forged signatures. Every new document made my stomach churn. Henry wasn't just manipulative, he was dangerous. Finally, I had enough. When my mom called to invite me to another family dinner, I decided that would be the moment. No more avoiding it. No more pretending. Dinner started like every other one. My mom floated around the kitchen, my dad was already on his second scotch, and Ava and Henry sat at the table, whispering to each other like they were the golden couple of the century. I barely touched my plate. My hands were shaking as I thought about what I was about to do. Lily, my dad said, breaking my thoughts. We were actually talking earlier and we've got an idea. Why don't you let Ava and Henry move into your house for a while? Just until they get on their feet. What? I blurted, caught completely off guard. It's just temporary, my mom added quickly, as if that made it any better. They need some time to figure things out, and you've got all that extra space. You're not married or anything, so? No, I said firmly. The room went silent. Ava's smile froze on her face, and my mom looked like I just slapped her. Excuse me, my dad said, his voice low. I said no, I repeated, my voice stronger this time. I'm not letting them move in with me. Especially not Henry. What's that supposed to mean? Ava snapped, her eyes narrowing. I took a deep breath and stood up, pulling out the stack of papers I'd brought with me. It means I know who Henry really is. Henry's confident smile faltered for the first time. What are you talking about? He said, his voice forced and steady. I threw the documents onto the table. Take a look. My parents and Ava leaned in, scanning the papers. My mom gasped when she saw the forged signatures. These are loans taken out in Ava's name, I said, pointing to the highlighted sections. And these? These are Henry's debts. He's not an investment manager. He's broke. And he's been using Ava's credit to fund whatever scams he's running. That's a lie, Henry said, his voice rising. She's jealous. She's always been jealous of Ava. Jealous? I said, laughing bitterly. Henry, I don't need to be jealous of anyone. I have a real job, a real future, and I don't need to manipulate people to get by. Lily, stop, my dad said, standing up. You don't understand what you're saying. This could ruin Ava's engagement. Dad, are you hearing yourself? I asked, incredulous. You're more worried about her engagement than the fact that he's been stealing from her? Henry wouldn't do that, Ava said, her voice shaking. But she kept staring at the papers, her face pale. Ava, it's all there, I said, softer this time. I know it's hard to hear, but he's lying to you. He's been lying to you this whole time. Henry slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. This is ridiculous. You're just trying to tear us apart because you're miserable and alone. That's enough. Aunt Hannah's voice rang out as she walked into the dining room, uninvited but perfectly timed. Hannah, what are you doing here? My mom asked, flustered. I'm here because Lily's right, she said, crossing her arms. I've seen the evidence, and I helped her gather some of it. Henry is a fraud, and if you keep ignoring this, you're putting Ava and the kids at risk. Ava looked at me, then at Henry, her voice barely a whisper. Is it true? Henry hesitated. For just a second, his confident mask slipped, and I could see the fear in his eyes. But then he doubled down. Of course not, he said. They're making this up. Stop lying. I snapped. Ava, check your credit report. Look at your bank statements. You'll see I'm telling the truth. My parents started talking over each other. Their voices a mix of anger and denial. This isn't the time to air dirty laundry, my mom said. You're blowing this out of proportion, my dad added. No, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. You're just too blind to see what's right in front of you. You've always been like this, choosing to believe whatever keeps the family looking perfect. But this is too much. I won't stay silent while Ava gets dragged down with him. Ava looked like she was about to cry. She pushed back her chair and stood up, her hands shaking. I need to think, she said, her voice barely audible. Henry reached for her arm, but she pulled away. I said I need to think, she repeated, more firmly this time. Then she turned and walked out of the room. Henry stood there, his jaw clenched, glaring at me. You've ruined everything, he hissed before storming out after her. I stood there, trembling. The room was so quiet, I could hear the clock ticking. You didn't have to do this, my mom said, her voice cold. Yes, I did, I said, grabbing my bag. And you'll thank me for it someday. Or maybe you won't. Either way, I'm done. Lily, wait. My dad started, but I was already walking out the door. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking back. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window, staring at the Seattle job offer on my desk. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about choosing myself. And for the first time, I knew I was ready to take that step. The news broke faster than I expected. Within days of the confrontation, Henry's schemes began unraveling completely. Ava must have looked at her credit reports because she called me, sobbing, barely able to get her words out. He did it, Lily, she cried. You were right. He took out loans in my name, tens of thousands of dollars. And he's been lying about everything. I sat there, the phone pressed to my ear, trying to calm her down. Ava, it's going to be okay, I said, even though I wasn't entirely sure how we were going to fix this. I don't know what to do, she whispered. He's threatening me now, saying I have to pay everything back or he'll. Her voice broke again. Come to my place, I said quickly. Bring the kids. We'll figure it out together. Ava showed up at my door that evening, her face pale and puffy from crying, her 2 kids trailing behind her. She was clutching a small duffel bag like it was her lifeline. I didn't know where else to go, she said. You're here now, I said, stepping aside to let them in. As the kids settled on the couch with a movie, Ava collapsed at my kitchen table, burying her face in her hands. I feel so stupid, she said. How could I not see what he was doing? I sat down across from her, placing a hand on her arm. Because he didn't want you to see, Ava. He played you, he played all of us. But this isn't your fault. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with regret. You tried to warn me and I didn't listen. I'm so sorry, Lily. For everything. Her apology caught me off guard. For the first time, she wasn't the confident, larger-than-life Ava I'd always known. She was just my sister, scared, hurt, and lost. We'll get through this, I said softly. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Ava filed police reports and worked with the lawyer to freeze her accounts and start untangling the mess Henry had made. Aunt Hannah stepped in, helping us organize the mountain of evidence we'd collected. She even found a financial fraud specialist willing to help Ava pro bono. Meanwhile, Henry's carefully crafted image fell apart. Once the police started digging, they uncovered even more fraudulent activity. Fake investments, unpaid debts, and even an old arrest record he'd managed to bury. He was arrested within a month, charged with multiple counts of fraud and identity theft. The scandal rocked the family. My parents, who had spent years maintaining their perfect facade, were now the subject of whispers in their social circles. Their wealthy friends distanced themselves, and the cracks in their finances became impossible to ignore. I found out through Aunt Hannah that my parents had been relying on risky investments Henry recommended, thinking they were too good to pass up. When those investments went belly up, it left them scrambling to cover their losses. "They've been living off appearances for years," Aunt Hannah told me one afternoon over coffee. "This is just the final straw." One night, my parents showed up at my apartment. Ava and the kids were asleep in the spare bedroom, and I was tempted not to answer the door, but something in me wanted to hear what they had to say. "Can we come in?" my mom asked, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I stepped aside, crossing my arms as they shuffled inside. We didn't realize how bad things had gotten," my dad said, sinking onto the couch. "With Henry. With Ava. With everything. You didn't want to realize it," I said bluntly. My mom winced but didn't argue. "You were right, Lily," she said, her voice shaky. "We should have listened to you. We've spent so much time trying to keep things looking perfect, we didn't see what was really happening." I let their words sink in. Part of me wanted to forgive them, to finally let go of the resentment I'd carried for so long. But another part of me wasn't ready, not yet. "You let this happen," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "You ignored the signs because it was easier than dealing with the truth. And Ava paid the price for it. We all did." My dad nodded, looking down at his hands. "We're sorry," he said. "We'll do whatever it takes to make things right." I didn't know if they meant it, but for the first time they looked genuinely ashamed. It was a start. As the dust settled, Ava began to rebuild her life. She moved into a small apartment near mine, determined to get back on her feet. We worked together to set up a budget and create a plan for paying off the debts Henry had left behind. Our relationship was different now, better, in a way. Ava finally saw me, not just as the independent one, but as her sister. And for once I wasn't invisible. One afternoon, as we packed up Ava's things from the house she'd shared with Henry, she found an old photo album. "Look at this," she said, flipping through the pages. It was full of pictures from our childhood, holidays, birthdays, family trips. In almost every photo, Ava was front and center while I lingered in the background. She looked up at me, tears in her eyes. "I was awful to you, wasn't I?" I smiled faintly, taking the album from her. "You were. But we were kids. And we've got time to make it better." She hugged me tightly, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were finally on the same page. Later that evening, after Ava and the kids had gone home, I sat in my apartment, staring at the Seattle job offer on my desk. This time there was no hesitation. I pulled out my phone, dialed the number on the letter, and smiled as the voice on the other end answered. "This is Lily," I said. "I'd like to accept the offer." Seattle wasn't just a new job, it was a new beginning. And for the first time I felt ready to leave the past behind. 6 months later, life looked different. Not perfect, but real. Ava had settled into her own place with the kids, juggling a part-time job while finishing her certification to become a teacher. She was nervous about starting over, but for the first time she looked like herself. Not the perfect version of Ava she tried so hard to maintain, but the raw, honest version. "I never thought I'd actually enjoy having a quiet life," she admitted over coffee one morning as her kids played in the living room. "Turns out, I don't need all that other stuff to feel happy." "You've always had everything you needed," I told her. "You just couldn't see it before." She smiled at me genuinely this time. "Thanks for not giving up on me, Lily." Even my parents were changing, though it wasn't easy. After everything with Henry, Aunt Hannah had convinced them to see a family therapist. First, I didn't think they'd stick with it, but they surprised me. One weekend, I visited them for dinner. My mom pulled me aside before I left, her hands fidgeting with a dish towel. "Lily," she began, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking about everything that happened. Everything you said." I looked at her, waiting. You were right, she said finally. We were so focused on keeping everything perfect, on making sure Ava was happy and visible. I thought you didn't need us the same way. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you. Her words made my chest tighten, but I nodded. It wasn't just you, Mom. It was all of us. We all let it happen. She reached out and squeezed my hand. I know I can't undo the past, but I'm trying. I hope you know how proud I am of you, Lily. For the first time, I believed her. One day, while packing up my apartment for the move to Seattle, I found the old VHS tape again. It was buried in a box I hadn't touched since that first night in the attic. I held it in my hands, turning it over. It wasn't just a tape anymore, it was a symbol. A reminder of how much had changed. Before I left, I invited Ava and Aunt Hannah over for one last night together. We sat on my living room floor, drinking wine while the kids built towers with my moving boxes. I pulled out the VHS tape and set it on the coffee table. Do you remember this? I asked Ava. She picked it up, squinting at the label. Oh my God. The science fair, she said with a laugh. Wow, I was such a brat back then. Yeah, I said, laughing with her. We didn't watch it. We didn't need to. Instead, Ava set it down and looked at me with a smile. You know, Lily, you've always been the strong one, she said. And I hate that I never saw it before. But I see it now. I didn't know what to say. For once, words didn't matter. When I arrived in Seattle, I sent my family a photo of the view from my new apartment. A bright, sprawling city with endless possibilities. Ava sent back a message right away. So proud of you. Don't forget to visit. The kids miss their Aunt Lily already. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged to a family. Not the perfect one we pretended to be, but a real one. Looking out over the city, I thought about everything that had brought me here. The old wounds, the fights, the truths we'd finally confronted. It hadn't been easy, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Sometimes I realized the most beautiful things are the ones hidden in the shadows. All it takes is a little light to see them. And now I was ready to shine.